One of the funny quirks of living in a small town like Moorton is how the characters and eccentrics that haunt the place are elevated to the point of being local celebrities. In some ways, it's quite a nice thing, a way of a community looking after their own and making sure that even those on the fringes who might get lost or overlooked in a big city get some acknowledgement and tolerance. Whether it's Skinbone Joe and his big old wife, or the lady who used to run the knitting shop down the bottom of High Street, the folks that might be described by some as oddballs and weirdos become famous in their own insular little part of the world, and pretty much everyone knows who you're talking about if you mention them. One of the oddest of these local celebrities, a figure well known around the town for years, was a woman named Doris Cleaves. Though to anyone living in Moorton in the late 90s and early 2000s, was better known as the Old Cat Lady. To be fair to her, Doris's activities were really not all that strange, nor were they exclusively related to cats. It was only later, after what happened, that anything remotely sinister was ever attached to her name. For a long time, she was just seen as a local fixture, a friendly old dear in her floppy rainbow hat and big woolly scarf that she wore no matter the weather, who, despite never actually intending to do so, managed to accidentally brighten the place and people's days a little with her warm smile and absolute commitment to Moorton's furrier inhabitants. Essentially, Doris was a massive animal lover. What made her noticeable to everyone else in town was that she would spend large portions of her day every day making sure that the local wildlife was fed and watered, trailing the same circuit every day for years and stopping off at various points to feed the various critters. In the mornings, she could be found in the town square, throwing seeds and small pieces of bread and corn to the pigeons, gulls, and crows that would routinely visit for a feed, and then spend the rest of their day dropping the digested remains onto the cars in the Fearmort car park. Not to mention the statues in the town square. We used to joke that one statue, the one of Moorton's first mayor, always seemed to get more than its fair share of white streaks. But that was probably just a coincidence. By lunchtime, she would have made her way up to the park and begun feeding the ducks from large bags she had filled with loaves of stale bread. New mums pushing trolleys would let on to her, and often she would share some of the bread with toddlers for them to throw to the ducks and geese, before moving on to make small piles of nuts and grains at the base of trees for the squirrels to eat. Later in the afternoon, she would visit the paddocks of the horses kept on the outskirts of town and close to the riding schools, which in fairness didn't actually need to be fed, but appreciated the extra apples and carrots she would take up for them. As the day came to a close and the sun began to set, she would make her way up to Sandhole Park, just a few streets back from the high street and a shortcut through to the other end of town to feed the cats. Now initially, so the story goes, there were only 2 stray cats in the Sandhole Park, and Doris had fed them for a few weeks with cat food she had bought at a discount. By the time that I was a teenager in Moorton, however, that number had grown exponentially. Seeing Doris in the park at dusk was a pleasing but admittedly rather unsettling sight. She would wander down through the trees to the main dirt path that traced its way beside the river and would then begin to call. Then, as if out of nowhere, a collection of between 20 and 30 cats would appear from the bushes, under the bridge, and the dugout hollows at the base of the trees. These cats did not have owners, but were without exception well-fed and healthy-looking, mostly because of the care and attention given to them by the Moorton cat lady. Of course, there were complaints. The odd busybody do-gooders or net curtain twitchers with nothing better to do who would complain about how scruffy and disgusting it was to have so many stray cats in one area. And of course, there were those who were genuinely concerned about the animals' welfare. What these folks failed to acknowledge, however, was that there was never any cat mess observable, chiefly because Doris had trained all the cats to do their business in the same small area by the rose bushes, and took on the responsibility of making sure that that area was regularly cleared out. As for animal welfare, the cats were better cared for than a lot of house cats. Well fed, fully vaccinated at Doris's own expense, and thanks to the local kids and a few charitable locals, they even had a small village of wooden cat houses built in one section of the park that they would retreat to when the weather wasn't good. Not that inclement weather would stop Doris. She was there every single day, no matter what the weather, which I have to say sometimes made for an unsettling sight. Passing as the light began to fade, you would see her silhouetted against the amber sky, surrounded by the tree's clawing branches with a host of pointy-eared familiars gathered around her. The cats would rest by her side, climb on her shoulders, or sleep in her lap as she simply sat there almost entirely motionless. She would invariably remain there until well after dark, at which point, a trip across the park, badly lit by the few street lamps on the road above, would show you her darkened figure, flanked and surrounded by 20 pairs of glimmering colored eyes staring out from the gloom and watching you as you moved. Then, it was kind of creepy. Naturally though, Doris was simply doing a nice thing. This admittedly creepy tableau took root in the minds of the local children, and there were a number of unkind and frankly horrifying stories whispered about the old cat lady. One spoke of how she would sometimes stand outside people's houses, still surrounded by her cats, and simply wait, motionless, like some kind of weird scarecrow in their gardens, staring up at the windows as the cats meowed and meowed. Others said that she had been seen several times on the town's CCTV systems, walking naked at 3 a.m. through the town square with a long procession of cats walking in single file behind her. Some said that she spoke to her cats, which was almost certainly true, but also that if you listened closely after the sun went down, you would hear the cats talking back in low feline whispers. Still more said that each of the cats was inhabited by the ghost of a child that the old cat lady had given birth to but then abandoned. This, so the story went, was why she felt obligated to come back and feed them every evening, with one twist on this story claiming that sometimes she was seen breastfeeding the cats as if they were her own suckling infants. All of this was nonsense, of course, but it was enough to exercise the minds of adolescent boys and make them wary of crossing the Sandhole Park alone after sunset, except of course, Robbie and Arn. Those two local misfits, as cocksure as they were stupid, were the first ones to point out just how well fed Moorton's collection of mangy Mongols were. "I swear, mate," Arn told me once, though I would never have described him as a mate of mine, "I've been up there a few times and seen her throwing steaks, like full fat steaks, out to the cats. Sometimes there's like pork ribs and lamb chops and all sorts. They're not just eating kitty cat or some dry cat food. It's like proper quality meat. She must spend fortunes at the butcher or in Fearmort every day. It's criminal." I had known Arn from school, and when he first mentioned this to me, apropos of nothing, we had been waiting at the bus stop for the same bus back to the Marston estate. Though we didn't really know each other and had never really hung out with each other at school, our mild acquaintance was enough for him to not only chew my ear off the entire way home, but to share with me his and Robbie's dastardly plan. "I mean, it's wrong, ain't it?" he said, framing his words as a question though they were really a statement. "I mean, here's me. Can't even afford to buy any decent cuts of meat, and she's out there throwing prime steak and liver and kidney and stuff to the bloody cats. It's not right. In fact, it's a massive waste. I'm thinking me and Robbie might have to get in on a bit of that." At the time, I hadn't really understood what he meant, though a fortnight later everything became clear. Doris, so the local rumor mill said, had been admitted to hospital. She had apparently gone to feed her cats as usual when the two lads wearing hoods had attacked her, stolen the meat she was planning to give to the cats, and had shoved her to the ground in the process. She had taken a somewhat nasty fall, but having taken the meat, the two lads had decided to go one step further and had also helped themselves to Doris's handbag too, leaving her prone on the ground to fend for herself. Luckily, another local man, having seen the incident, rushed to Doris's aid and called an ambulance for her. I, meanwhile, having heard about this incident on the very same bus journey home, decided to contact Moorton police myself and tell them where they might want to look if they wanted to find the lads who had done this. 2 days later, the police did look, and having found the two boys at their flat halfway through their fourth steak meal in a row, with Doris's handbag still plainly in view on their sofa, promptly arrested them both. This, however, is not where the story ends. Nor is this strange mugging the most sinister element of the story. You see, it turns out that whilst in hospital, Doris came to a horrible realization. Whilst she was feeding the cats a great amount of meat each night, she was not paying a great fortune for it at the Combi Mart or Moorton's Butchers, but instead she had accepted a discount offer months earlier from a local man named Arnold Daugherty. A man who, though he lived in Moorton, worked as an orderly at the main general hospital in the city, the one that Doris was taken to after her fall, where she had recognized him and realized what he had been doing. Doris came to the realization that the cheap meat the orderly was providing her was not in fact beef or lamb he had gotten at a discount from an abattoir, but medical waste which he was supposed to have incinerated, but instead smuggled out of the hospital. In short, what she had been feeding to the cats all these months was human flesh. Flesh and organs that Daugherty had then cut into pieces and sold to an unsuspecting old lady for her to feed to the cats. Knowing no different, the local cats had been munching away on human flesh daily for the better part of 2 years. Once Doris reported this, a few things happened very quickly. Arnold Daugherty was arrested and revealed to have been living under an alias. He is now serving a long sentence for his medical malpractice and a number of other outstanding offenses for which he was already wanted. Doris Cleaves, unable to get about as much as she used to because of her healing broken hip, moved into the Moorton retirement home. After a campaign in the local newspaper raised the money to fund it, she took up charge of the petting zoo project run out of the home, where residents and local school kids could go to interact with animals from bunny rabbits to gerbils to birds and of course cats. As for Robbie and Arn, they too are now behind bars where they are apparently receiving counseling to help them deal with the reality of what they likely consumed over the course of those 2 days, stuffing themselves with what they thought were steaks. And finally, and perhaps most worrying, there are the cats. Realizing that in Doris's absence, the Sandhole Park cats would have been without food for several days, the locals of Moorton clubbed together to buy some legitimate cat food and volunteered to take on feeding duties. The planned feeding, which volunteers had hoped to film to show Doris and cheer her up, made the local newspapers not because it was a huge success, but because when the volunteers arrived at the park, there was not a single cat there to be found. In the weeks that followed, I heard some awful rumors of how graves of the newly buried up at the Moorton Cemetery had been horribly disturbed, as if someone or something had been trying to dig down in an attempt to get to the meat locked in the coffins below. How much of that is true, however, I can't honestly say.